We've gone on quite a journey with this show.
I think that the biggest factor, though, that makes Joel kind of in the wrong is that Ellie, I think, would have gone with Marlene.
But again, that you can't just say that.
And what I did was the doctor stepped back. I immediately shot it.
Welcome to Backseat Directing,
Where we talk about movies, TV shows, comics, and more.
We're your hosts,
Andrew
and Aaron.
We post new episodes every Monday and Thursday.
And on this episode, we're going over The Last of Us.
3, 2, 1,
Action. All right, Andrew, The Last of Us is officially over. Season 1, that's a wrap. It's done. We've gone on quite a journey with this show. Before this show happened, we hadn't played the game. You dabbled with it a little bit, but I don't think you finished it before, right?
No, I hadn't finished it. I played it very little.
Yeah. So we've within these 9 weeks, we've played the whole game. We've started The Last of Us Part 2. We're totally invested. You might even be finished with Part 2.
Almost done with Part 2.
Yeah. So we've definitely been invested in this story. This story has kind of captured us for these last 2 months.
Not only all of that media consumption, but I've also recently discovered the Last of Us companion podcast, which is hosted don't know how to say what we do, which is hosted by Troy Baker, who's the voice of Joel, and Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann, which are showrunners for the show, basically the creators, where Neil Druckmann is actually the creative designer for the games with Naughty Dog. So I've consumed a bunch of hours of that too. So we're really deep into this and obviously have a passion and love for it, doing all these episodes on it, consuming all this content. I want to preface what I'm going to say for this episode with some of the behind the scenes information that I've gained for this episode are from that podcast. So it's definitely cool to check out and hear the insights from people who created it, because in a way they're somewhat objectively true. They can tell you what they imagine Ellie or Joel to be thinking in certain moments of the story, but also they'll say that is open to interpretation because they recognize that it's art. So it's a really cool thing to listen to and learn from.
Yeah, and HBO Max also has a 30-minute episode called The Making of The Last of Us, which is a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's kind of like a mini documentary of how they made this movie or these shows. And then they have all the behind-the-scenes stuff at the end of the episodes. I'd always watch those after the fact on YouTube because I didn't want to see the teaser for the next episode. I already know I'm going to watch the next one. I don't want to know, how they are going to do anything for that next episode.
Also, to preface this episode, Aaron and I are wearing our Joel flannels. We both got suited up for this episode, ready for the apocalypse.
I'm ready. Bring it on. These are really comfortable.
But as we've been doing, we're going to go through our final arc in a 3-episode stint. So we've done the first 6, and now we're going to do 7 through 9. It's a lot to cover, so we're going to try to jump into it because there's more to cover than we have time. We don't want you. We could sit here with you guys for 3 hours, but I don't know if anybody wants to listen.
There's
for that long.
9 episodes, and this is our 4th episode that we've recorded about this show.
Yeah, if you want to check out our exclusive episode most recently that we did on episode 8 of The Last of Us, that's episode 66. So you can check that one out. We played the game while reviewing that section of the game/show. So that was a ton of fun.
Yeah, and that was for episode 8, which we're going to talk about even more this time while we're not distracted and whatnot. This episode was the one that we were looking forward to the most and all that. But yeah, I don't think there's been a topic that we've talked about more in terms of one piece of content than this show. We've talked about the MCU, the DCU a lot and stuff, but it's all been branched off into different topics of those kind of broad topics. But we've done 4 episodes on this one show. So that right there shows how much we like this story.
And audiences have responded to it pretty well. I mean, obviously the show, but also our content towards the show. So in terms of our, little niche group that we have of people that watch, we've had some good engagement over this. So definitely people love it just like we love it. So we're going to start with episode 7. That episode is called Left Behind. It is 55 minutes long with a rating of 7.4, which is the first thing I want to ask you about this episode. One of the lowest rated episodes of the show, along with episode 3, which both, not so coincidentally, feature same-sex relationships in the episode. Do you think that those ratings ring true, or do you think that it's because of the review bombing?
I will say episode 7 was probably my least favorite as well, but I really liked.
So you're a homophobe?
Yes.
No.
You caught me. Caught me.
Audience, don't cancel Aaron.
Oh my gosh.
He's a good guy. I'll vouch for him.
I was gonna finish by saying I really liked episode 3. I think just episode 7 it just felt longer. You know, like it didn't feel like, I don't know, even for so episode 7 is based off of the DLC for the game. So it's a part that you get to play after you found out the whole story. And proportionally, this episode, and I guess episode 3, got a lot more screen time than you would like in proportion to the game. You know?
Yeah, in relation to the other arcs of the game.
Right. Like the gameplay wasn't that much longer than this episode, you know, but then all the other episodes, the gameplay was much longer than those episodes.
Yeah, it was like Aaron said, it's based on the DLC by the same name. And it's something that the showrunners thought was really important to focus on and get right in the story. Because I think episode 7 kind of signifies where Ellie takes over as the main character of the show. Because you obviously start from Joel's perspective with him and Sarah in the very beginning. And I think then Ellie enters the screen and then begins this transition, which really solidifies in episode 7 when Joel is now, injured and laying in the bed. Ellie takes the reins, and she literally takes the reins in the game, which there's a cool line from Neil Druckmann where he says that he loves watching people play this portion of the game because they almost always say the same thing, which is, "Oh, cool, I'm Ellie." The excited reaction to switch over to this new perspective of somebody who's been a companion to you the whole time. And I think they captured that feeling really well with the shift in focus. Like, maybe that's part of the reason to spend the extra time on this episode, was to really solidify that change that, okay, audience, your surrogate experience that you are living in this world through is now more so Ellie than it is Joel.
Yeah.
And that's going to be important moving forward going into season 2 as well, from what we know. I would try not to spoil too much and try to remain vague, because I know a lot of TV show watchers.
I've seen a lot of spoilers for part 2, just with people reviewing part 1, and it's been annoying.
Yeah, so let's try not to be those people.
We're just part 1 here today, Andrew.
Okay.
But yeah, maybe I didn't like episode 7 and this is not to say that it was bad, right? I liked the episode, but in comparison to the other episodes, it was probably my least favorite.
Bad episode of this show, though, is like
a good episode of any other show.
One's the best.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, is like, a statistical low year for me is a career high for another quarterback. You know what I'm saying? But I played the DLC Left Behind probably like the day or two before this came out. So it was kind of just very repetitive. It was like back to back. I got to see the exact same thing. So maybe that's why I was a little bit distracted while watching this episode.
I do wish that years later now that somehow when I had downloaded The Last of Us, that segment of the game had been smushed in to the chronologically into order, because I also, like you, played the Left Behind after beating the whole game, which you could argue that's the way it was meant to be played, because that's the way that it came out when the game came out. But I think it would have been cooler to play it chronologically, in my opinion, to kind of get an idea of what Ellie went through before you're facing David and at the farm and all this. But
I wonder if they had this part worked out before the game.
I think that...
I would assume not.
Neil Druckmann, he originally wrote the Left Behind series, I believe, as a companion comic book. He has all kinds of things like this. He wrote the story of Ellie's mom way before the show came out. He said he talked at Comic-Con with Ashley Johnson about filming like a short live-action film or a short scene showing this backstory for Ellie's mom. They had a note written from Ellie's mom to her that's, I believe, is in the game. Like, he's very much into the world building, and he has like this rich backstory either in his mind or actually written down for all these things. So I imagine he had that in place when the original story was written.
It's very interesting. So, Andrew, what is this episode about?
So Left Behind is about, at its core, it's about Ellie's philosophy for why she's not going to leave Joel behind. So I didn't do that on purpose, but that's exactly what it is. So she has Joel on this dirty mattress on the floor, and he is telling her, leave me behind. Because Joel's worst fear, right, something we've already discussed from, I think, episode 6 mostly, is that he's going to fail Ellie, that the result of his actions will lead to her dying. He blames himself for his daughter's death. So he's pushing her away, telling her to go, right, on this mattress, telling her to leave him, because he wants her to have the best chance of survival, even if that's not with him. And we have her go upstairs and look in the mirror, and she remembers her why. Her reason why she won't leave Joel behind is this story at the mall with Riley. Riley gave her this philosophy that we see at the end of the episode, where Riley says, whether it's 2 minutes or 2 days, we fight for every second that we have left. We'll take what we can get. And so even if it means risking her life, they know that these people that they just fought with, the Raiders, are probably somewhere around this area. She couldn't have gotten far with Joel, how injured he is. They're still in Colorado. So they know they're in danger, Joel especially. And Ellie's just every bit as smart as him, knowing the same thing, but she would rather risk her life on the chance that maybe she can save Joel, maybe she can stitch him up, maybe she can find antibiotics, maybe he won't die. And the person who's now the most important person to her in the world, she never had her parents, she never had that figure, and the closest person to her, Riley, will come to see she lost. She doesn't have it in her to prioritize herself over Joel. And that is Ellie's whole journey, ultimately leading up to episode 9, that we'll get to talk about more later, her self-sacrificing nature. And I think that it's really beautifully displayed in this story. How do you think that it compared to the game, the Left Behind DLC?
It was pretty close.
Pretty spot on.
Yeah, it was.
The show's been.
Yeah, the whole show is very accurate to the source material, probably, other than how many infected you see.
Yeah, that's two things there. The showrunners, Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann, have said that they plan to take the same approach to season 2 as their philosophy to season 1, which they said is keeping the soul of the game there and changing things where they felt like it needed to be changes for the TV format, or where it could be changed to improve. Changes like Sam being deaf, or giving us more backstory to Bill and Frank. But they also said that they plan to lean more into the aspects that they've added, like where you step on something and the infected can sense you from a mile away. They plan to, seems like, lean more into the infected, because the way Craig Mazin said it was that they were learning how to deal with the infected in this season. They were learning how to make them basically not cringy or foolish looking. They wanted to make it work for the TV format, make them scary, make them realistic, and he feels like they did that in season 1, so now they can move forward 2 feet forward into season 2 and kind of work more with the infected. That's what I was reading from what he said on the podcast.
That'd be fantastic. I think that's been our biggest complaint, and the majority of other watchers as well, is just, where are all the zombies?
Yeah. And the good thing, too, for our listeners, which I think listening to the companion podcast is really cool, but the good thing for our listeners is I'm going to condense down a lot of the things that they said, so you don't have to listen to 9 hours of podcast. So, I just discovered it earlier this week, so I'll condense some of the things that they said in this episode, and it'll be probably a little bit more digestible. If you're interested in spending that kind of time, you can.
It is a lot of fun when shows do this, though, and like have a companion podcast and talk a little bit more of like the ins and outs of how the show it was made and stuff. That stuff's like super fascinating to me. Like Survivor has a companion podcast.
I haven't listened to that yet. But obviously for people like us, like who become obsessed with content media that we really, really like, it's super beneficial to have that, because it's like you're wringing the last drops out of something. Like when I played Arkham Knight for the first time, I was so obsessed. I was like gonna rewatch every Batman movie and animated movie and show, because you just want to wring every drop out of Batman, out of The Last of Us, when you're in that mode.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think, going back to the episode, I think that Storm Reed phenomenally portrayed Riley. I mean,
yes,
the castings for this show have been on par with like the first couple phases of the MCU. level of accurate casting. Pedro's amazing. Riley, Storm Reed is amazing as Riley. Bella Ramsey, my favorite in the show. They're also phenomenal, but I also want to touch on the game actors that they've put into the show, because Neil Druckmann knows these people personally and is involved in making the show because he made the game with them. So we had Jeffrey Pierce, who played Perry, the lieutenant with Kathleen, Troy Baker as James in episode 8, the lieutenant for David, and then Ashley Johnson is in episode 9 as Anna, which we're going to get to, as Anna Williams, Ellie's mom. Merle Dandridge is Marlene in both the show and the game, which is kind of the coolest.
Lucky her.
And then Laura Bailey is the nurse in this episode. Do you know who Laura Bailey is? Or not in this episode. Laura Bailey is the nurse in episode 9. She voices Abby, and she also did multiple voices in the original game. She voiced the nurse in the game, and she voiced a reporter in the beginning of the game. So Neil kind of was very impressed with her in the first game and wanted to find her part in part 2, so that's how she became Abby.
Nice.
So it was super cool for her to get this small cameo in the show and be behind the mask. I think she's the one who says, who's kind of pleading with Joel and he has them turn around.
Yeah. And Abby is someone from part 2, so if you don't know who Abby is...
Don't worry about it yet.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't try to find out.
So what else do we have to discuss from episode 7 before we move on to episode 8?
Well, I think the big impact of episode 7 was that both Riley and Ellie got bit by an infected. And this is basically what started the whole story, right? We find out the origin of how Ellie got infected in the first place. And that's what's starting this whole journey of going cross country. But this is also the first time that she had to kill someone, and it ended up being her best friend.
It's also the story of her first love, her first kiss.
Yeah.
It's a lot of bubbling emotions mixed up into one big pot. And I think one big thing about this romantic relationship between the two of them is that it's portrayed brilliantly in both the game and the show. It has all this nuance and nervousness to two people that, because they're not only in the boat of not knowing if their friend likes them, they don't even know if their friend is gay. They don't even know if there's a potential that they could like them. It's something that we have to assume that they've never discussed or that they couldn't possibly know. And an interesting point that I've heard made online as well is that the world stopped in this universe in 2003, whereas in the game it's 2013. But 2003 is a very different time. For those of you that weren't born yet, a very different time than today. And there wasn't as much acceptance, there wasn't as much tolerance. And if the world halts and freezes there, then potentially there's still a lot of stigma. Not that there's still not plenty of places in the world now where there is lots of issues in this, but we've come a long way. 2003, there was a lot of hatred and insensitivity towards the LGBTQ community. So not only are they facing potential romantic rejection, but they're facing unveiling themselves for who they truly are and just not being accepted as a person, which I think is a really interesting additional layer that I had personally not thought about outside of the show until it was brought up to me. Because in my mind, I just kind of think of it,
it's like, oh, cool.
Love is love. Yeah, but that's realistically not the way the world is, right?
Right.
So I think that there's so many layers to this episode, and the actors have 6 different faces and emotions under emotions, both of them, for them to be so young and turn in the performance that they turned in, you laugh with them, you cry with them, you have a good time with them, and then you mourn for them. It's really well done. But how did you feel about it?
Oh, same as you. I think I enjoyed it more with the game because I got to see it first, and then again I saw Left Behind, the show, right after, so it was kind of too soon to really digest. But they did it really beautifully. This show, the most surprising thing is how emotional it is. That was something that I was not ready for. Thank God this show did not come out all at once, because I don't think I would have been able to handle the emotional range that I would have to go through by binging the show.
Just tears on your face still going into episode 4?
Dude, just destroyed.
Well, I want to ask you what you thought, if you agree with me here, because this is an opinion I feel strongly about. I think that Riley comes and grabs Ellie and brings her to the mall and takes her on the journey of the 7 wonders of the mall, not more than to just say goodbye. I think she's not just trying to put Ellie up on this pedestal to knock her down, which is something we all do, right? It's like, oh, here's the good news, here's the bad news off to the side. But I think that it's more than that. I think Riley wants Ellie the whole time to convince her to stay. Did you agree with that assessment?
I can see that for sure.
I think she's waiting for Ellie in her own way, in her kid brain, because these are both.
I think it also is showing her saying like, "I love you."
Yeah.
You know, and like
Without
you said,
saying
like if maybe that's something that they've never really talked about before. You know.
Yeah, I think that
It's like I'm leaving, but I love you, and if you love me too, you can convince me to stay.
Because what's the first thing she says when she tells her that she's leaving? She says, "I asked Marlene if you could come with me." Like, I think to both of them, to both Ellie and Riley, they're the most important person to each other in the world. You know, neither of them have parents, and Riley's actually lost her parents. We know that in the story that Riley had her parents and lost them, whereas Ellie never knew her parents. So I think that the journey, there's a parallel here, right, between Riley and between Riley and Joel, actually, where both of them have experienced this deep, deep loss. So Riley with her parents and Joel with his daughter. And so they experience their fear through pushing people away, whereas Ellie experiences her fear through pulling people closer. And that's a lesson that Riley learns by the end of the episode. That's Riley's arc, which it's kind of her parting gift to Ellie, and she imparts on her. So Riley's first pushing Ellie away. She's saying, "I'm leaving. The Fireflies are important to me. I want to liberate the world. I'm leaving you, the person that I love," even though that's subtext, that they don't know they love each other yet. But Riley is saying, "Don't leave, stay. I want to hold on to the people that I love." And then in that episode later, we get Joel saying, "Go, leave me, survive." Joel prioritizes surviving above everything else, and he prioritizes pushing people off and keeping them at arm's length because he can't let himself feel the way that he felt about Sarah without being destroyed again. And Ellie is taking the lesson that Riley learned by the end of the episode, which is 2 minutes, 2 days, 2 hours, whatever we have, I'm going to hold you close to me. And, you know, she eventually will, when she gives him in episode 8, when she ejects him, she lays down on the bed and hugs him in kind of this close, tender moment. So I just thought that was a really cool parallel between Riley and Joel, is they both want to protect themselves and people, and this fear causes them to push them away, whereas Ellie's fear calls her to pull people close. Like, Ellie would sacrifice herself, obviously, and so would Joel, but it means different things to them.
How did Riley miss the infected in the mall?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's almost like a plot error.
Because she clearly went through the mall beforehand, went to all these different stores and locations in the mall to kind of prep things for this amazing night that she had planned with Ellie. And we know that because when they were in the arcade, she was like, "Yeah, like I spent all day yesterday trying to bust open this coin machine so we can play these games."
Probably would have made some noise, right?
Right.
But she also...
So she was there the day before, for sure.
Well, she's lived there. She has like a sleeping bag there and pipe bombs that she's watching over. I don't know, babysitting them. But that's kind of an error, in my opinion. In the game, it made more sense where she's visiting there. She's like, Ellie, I think, says like, "Oh, it's closed off." And she says, "If it's closed off, why isn't it closed off?" So it seems like both their first time going there, or maybe Riley's just, I think in the game maybe Riley's been through there but wasn't staying there because she seemed to be acutely aware of the arcade and what game was in there, which is a cool reference. Again, I'm gonna do another Easter egg. The game is called, what is it called in the arcade game in the Last of Us video game is called The Turning. That's what it's called, which is a reference because Neil Druckmann originally wrote that as a working title for the game, The Turning, instead of The Last of Us. But what he had envisioned for it, I think, was Mortal Kombat 2, which is what they end up using in the arcade in the actual show, because they can now get the rights to it because it's being made through HBO Max, which is Warner Brothers, which owns the rights to Mortal Kombat. So I think that was really cool that they were able to pay homage to that. There's a lot of cool small things both in the show and the games that hint at the fact that it was October 2003, 2013, depending on show or game, because there's the Halloween store and there's Halloween costumes. If you go around in the game, calendars are all set to September and October for people who haven't flipped it yet, you know? And there's all these like dates and references it's a lot of attention to detail in both.
Yeah, definitely. I think a more believable sense of would just be like the infected walking around and kind of just stumbling into the same store that they were in.
Yeah,
you know, rather than being like attached to the wall and then waking up and, you know.
Yeah, there's a reference to...
But hey, at least we got to see an infected. That
infected has a reference to the DLC also, because I think he's in like an American Girl doll store, like some kind of doll store that is in the mall in the game. Not the mall with Riley, but the mall that you're in where you're trying to save Joel.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of attention to detail, like I said, but I think that I would definitely side with you in saying it would have been better the game route. The show, like I said, has their reasons for going sparingly on zombies, which I don't always agree with.
Yeah. But don't fully understand either. It seems like they put in a bunch of research and trial and error to make them look as phenomenal as they did. And then it just seemed like they didn't take advantage of them that much.
Yeah, I think that maybe they were just testing the audience reaction to them still, you know? And with the nature of a streaming service, you don't just like put out a pilot and then wait a little bit and see if the show hits, you know? They filmed the entire show before anyone ever, general audiences got an eye on it. You know, they still, I'm sure, had test audiences, but still.
Yeah, but it looked so good. Like, what were they afraid of?
I don't know. What
were they so hesitant about?
The stunt actors did a great job as all of the runners and clickers and zombies.
Yeah, and they got the original voice actors to do the clicker noises again, and stuff. So like, I don't understand why they were so hesitant to use these infected.
I think they'll play it safe in season 2.
I hope so. I hope so.
So one last thing I want to ask you about this episode, something that Craig Mazin was really proud of, he said he's big on sound design, was, did you notice the sound of the coin as it entered the arcade game?
Not off the top of my head, no.
I heard they played it in a video I was listening to, and he said he got really granular with the sound on certain aspects, which sound is a completely underrated part of any movie or show. And the specific feeling as a kid growing up going to arcade that you get when you hear a coin go in has this click and roll. And they nailed the sound effects in this episode, like the music choices. I love the way they permeate "Take on Me" throughout, like throughout the show and the game. Because I've literally added Ashley Johnson's version of "Take on Me" to my Spotify playlist and listened to it every day since I ran into that cutscene in the game. It's like my current favorite song. I love the portrayal of it, so I'm glad to see that in the shows as well.
Yeah.
You ready to talk about episode 8?
Yeah, let's do it. But before we do, let's go ahead and take time to thank the audience. We appreciate everyone listening to our podcast. You know, not too long ago, we were just 2 guys. You know, and now we're still just 2 guys talking to like what, 10 people? Tens of people. But yeah, we post new episodes every Monday and Thursday. We've been doing so since last August, which we haven't missed a day.
And I'm also insanely grateful to those tens of people. I do not mean to sound like I think that's a low number, because I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie 8th Grade. But the girl in that movie posts videos like every day, and it's like 1 view, 0 view. And it'd be very discouraging if we had 0 views on all these videos. So the tens of people that watch, I love you guys.
Yes, thank you.
Because just knowing that you guys are watching makes me feel like we're interacting with a group of people, no matter the size.
Yeah, we have so much fun doing this. Like,
for anyone else to join in is just a blast.
Yeah, it's one of, if not the best day of the week. You know, we get to just chill and hang out. We record a few episodes at a time, you know, so we're just
delaying this recording one day to tomorrow. And I was literally didn't want to do it for the reason that I have to wait another day to record. It's fun. It's exciting.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. It's a good excuse for us to hang out too, you know.
As excited as we are, we have to talk about this show because that's what we have to do. So we're going to move on to episode 8, which we discussed. We already kind of covered in episode 66 of our show. Episode 8 is called When We Are in Need. It's 50 minutes and has the highest rating of the show so far. I think it's moved down to a 9.4 since we last discussed it on IMDb from a 9.5. But we are going to cover this episode a little bit faster because of how much we've talked about it previously. I have a few points that I want to discuss, but I don't want to steamroll you. So is there anything you had in mind for episode 8?
So this was the episode a few weeks before, once we were both past this part on the game, we were like, can't wait for the David episode. I'm so curious of how they're going to go about this.
Most anticipated episode for me.
Yes,
for sure.
Same. And this episode, you had a few people over and watched at your house, and I wasn't able to make it. And I was really bummed that I couldn't go because I was like, oh, guys, this episode could be the best episode of the season, And it was pretty darn good. I think they left out a few things that I was really looking for, but I think my expectations were just too high.
You had game expectations.
Yeah, I just had too high of expectations, and I based off of what they've done so far up to this point, I should have had them a little bit lower. And
let's talk about the action, by the way, guys.
Yes.
Not the storytelling.
Yes.
That's the main thing that he's
Yes, exactly. So, but anyways, who's David?
So David is a cult leader, is the simplest way to say it. David is a master manipulator who, over at the Silver Lake Resort, has this group of followers who trust in him wholeheartedly. To them, David's word is God's word, essentially. And the only reference that we really have to this in the game, to the religious aspect, is this banner that I think says something like, "When we are in need, he will provide." It's in the big steakhouse in the game, in the center dining area, and then we see it in the exact same spot in the show. But the show definitely leans more heavily into that religious aspect, opening with David preaching a sermon, basically. He's referencing a passage he's probably read a bunch of times, that it has to do with rebirth, renewal, and that's kind of the theme for David's philosophy on the episode, is that the world was reborn through the apocalypse. Through cordyceps, the world was reborn. And now in this world, he has found religion, but he uses it to manipulate the masses. He uses it as a tool. And David's manipulation permeates this episode. I mean, his skills with sitting Ellie down, and a good manipulator doesn't really convince you of a thought. They convince you to convince yourself of a thought. So there's a great way that Craig Mazin describes it, is where he's not trying to pull Ellie in. He's trying to get her to lean in. And I think in that conversation, it's not as much the bond as built in the game, which we have harped on in the previous episode of our show.
Yeah, but I want to talk about it here too. I don't want to just say like, hey, go watch this other episode that we recorded. Yeah. Like the contrast between the show and the game, right? Like you said, you just talked about how we got introduced to David in the show. We got to see him kind of in that leadership role of the cult, but in the game, we met him in a different way. And we met him when Ellie was going hunting, found a deer, shot the deer with her bow, which we did not get to see in the show at all, which I know was one of your favorite weapons.
She used the gun instead.
Yeah. But then, so right now, Joel is laying in the cabin, still stabbed. But in the game, in the game, Ellie chases down the deer because it gets shot, but it kind of runs off. And it runs off into this like abandoned town, it seems. And that's when she runs into David and his right-hand man, James.
The show is played by Troy Baker. Awesome.
Who plays Joel in the game. And right here, we get to see Ellie kind of command the scene, right? We get to see that she's smart, that she's not scared.
She's trying to put on an intimidating front for
yes.
You can hear her deepening her voice. She's like, the same goes for Buddy Boy. And like, you can hear her trying to make herself big, trying to make herself intimidating. But she hasn't quite been in this exact situation before, where without Joel,
right.
But she definitely does command the scene, and she takes control of them. She's smart, which is a theme for Ellie, especially at the end of this episode. It really shows her surviving nature using, her brain.
Yes. So David's trying to kind of talk her down and see if like they can share. And he's like, look, we come from a village with a lot of people, men, women, children. And she's like, well, yeah, me too.
She's quick to lie.
Because David wants the deer and wants her as well. So
the implication, double-edged sword, if we come from a group with a lot of people, is not only he's saying it to her as we come from a lot of people, we need to feed them, they're starving. But the hidden implication of what he's saying is hey,
don't mess with us.
I have a lot of people.
Yeah.
I like make this decision knowing that.
Right. And basically they kind of end up bartering back and forth for this deer. He's like, look, I'll trade you something for it. We have supplies, blah, blah. And she's like, do you have medicine?
Yeah.
Do you have medicine? Need medicine.
Which is penicillin that he ends up giving her, which is derived from a fungus.
Yeah. Interesting. And so he sends off his right-hand man, James, right?
Yes.
And James goes back to the town to get the medicine.
And he sends him off. He says, it's not code, James. Just go.
Yeah.
And the whole time, too, David is eerily calm, more so than you would expect anyone to be with a gun pointed at them.
Yep.
So it definitely displays David's nerves of steel, and the manipulator in him always feels in control, even in a situation where he absolutely isn't.
Now, this is the part that we really didn't get to see in the show that we saw in the game that I was really hoping we would see in the show. And that's when James is gone and she's just with David, and they bring the deer into shelter, right? Under cover, so they're not freezing, getting hit by the wind, the storm, the snow. And they kind of get to talking, and then they are attacked by infected, and David pulls out a gun that he had, a little revolver that he had like stuffed in his pant leg, and she's like, you had that the whole time? And he's like, yeah, sorry.
That's something that, the biggest thing that built the trust for me with David was that he could have pulled that gun on her, when she had her eyes turned,
right,
different instances, but he chose not to.
Yeah.
But that's because I think, and tell me if you agree or disagree with me here, I think the moment he sets eyes on Ellie is the same moment that he decides that he wants her by his side.
Yes.
We know later in the episode that he wants her in more than a fatherly way, and he wants her as a companion.
Yeah.
I
think he also knew pretty early too that she was with Joel.
Yeah, it was Neil Druckmann who I think put it best, is David lives in a world where he is surrounded by sheep, even with his closest ally, James. And when he looks at Ellie, this 14-year-old girl, he immediately sees a wolf. He sees a kinship with her because they are both strong people, survivors. They're people that won't be led around. And even though he tries to put a leash on her throughout the episode, he really can't. And the more he can't, the more he respects her and sees her as an equal. Whereas he sees no one else in the world as an equal. And that's, I think, why, because he could have the same affection towards any of even with his predilections of being a creep, he could have the same affection towards any of the young girls that live in Silver Lake, but he doesn't. He has for Ellie because she is different. She's unique. And so I think immediately his calm demeanor in that scene comes from, I don't want to fight with this person.
Yeah.
And like you said, he might know she's with Joel immediately too. I mean, he's very smart. He makes that connection immediately too, and then that connection leads to, all right, now I have to eliminate Joel, not only for revenge for, I think his name was Alec, the guy who was killed, not only for revenge for Alec, but also to eliminate the other male figure in her life.
Yeah, but this is where we build that trust with David, right? Because in the game, we didn't really get that much sense of like, oh, he's a creep. They kept that hidden all the way up until the moment where he's like, everything happens for a reason. Just like this little girl coming in to my life right now, when it's weird. Someone that died in our village was killed by a guy who was alone, but with a little girl.
He's like just like this little girl coming into my life when I just happen to be single right now.
Yeah.
I just recently got out of a long-term relationship.
That's right.
But yeah, so the moment when he unveils that in the game, as my heart sunk into my stomach, I was like,
oh, like this son of a gun. Yeah.
And then it's even more nefarious than trying to kill her, actually.
We talked about this a little bit when we were playing the game in our last episode that we talked about, episode 8. But did you, when you were watching the show, did you feel like, I kind of have a hint of who David is before we got to that point? Like, did you think that he was a little creepy, a little culty beforehand, or did you kind of trust him, even though you've played the game?
No, trying to be objective, even if both of us, I think, tried to be objective, we still would have lost some trust. And I think the main reason is there's a look that he shares with James early on, that kind of says, you and me are hiding something from everyone else in this room. Like, there's just the two of us.
We know the truth right now.
Which is, he's inherently deceptive in that moment. And then when he's outside speaking with James, he challenges James's faith not James's faith to God, it seems like, but James's faith in himself, in David. So he's kind of holding himself up on this pedestal that no human should.
I think we had a comment on one of our TikToks and they were like, oh yeah, I trusted him. And I was like, what are you talking about, man? Like,
maybe they didn't play the game, or maybe, because I could see someone still trusting him, you know?
I don't know. It's still, and again, I played the game first, so I knew it was coming, but something still felt off, you know, like, and I think I would have picked up on that even not playing the game first. I wouldn't have known what it was, but I would have not trusted him as much as I did playing the game first. You know,
I want to kind of move on so that we get further into this episode, because there's another big point I want to hit in this episode to ask you about too. But in between that, I think the sound of this episode again is really phenomenal, and to me, it's in the dialogue. I saw a video online of somebody saying that when Pedro Pascal screams "What town" in this episode, like they're like, I could listen to that before hitting a PR set, like just the way, just "What town," and like. It's so like primal, like the savagery, the rage. He's completely unhinged, which is completely, you know, opposite to what we'll see in episode 9, where he is what I've been calling gone Terminator mode. He is just robotic and shut himself off in episode 9. In this moment, he's emotional and rageful. So I thought that was really cool to see. Then Ellie's primal moments, obviously the big two are when she screams. What does she say? She says, tell him that Ellie's the name of the girl. Cut off your finger. And that is, Bella performed the hell out of that. And then the question I have for you finally comes to her last primal moment, when she is screaming and ironically hacking David to little pieces, which is what he threatened to do to her. And she's cutting him, blood splashing on the camera. And I just think that it's like a weirdly aesthetic and beautiful moment, contrasted with how dark and grim it is, and the turn in her character. What did you think of that moment, how it was portrayed in the show?
She did not stop. She just hit after hit. And I was like, man, how long are they going to let her do this for, you know?
Yeah.
And she just kept going. And I think that kind of elevated the impact of the moment, you know, letting it linger a little bit longer than maybe what the audience is comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that the direction they gave her was to give everything. And that's how they described it, is that Bella really just gave all of herself into that performance. And I think when you give all of yourself, what you're left with is empty. So I think that, to me, would be the best way to describe the end of that scene, you know, how she comes out of it, the way she's walking outside when Joel finds her, and even into the beginning of the next episode, is that she has emptied herself. And so it's, to me, kind of a symbolic transformation of the youthful, innocent Ellie that we have in the show up until now. You know, it's innocence contrasted with violence, the violent heart that David mentioned, the line that they added to the show that wasn't in the game. So she has emptied herself of that innocence, emptied herself of that emotion, and now what's left is kind of a blank slate. Is it going to be filled back up with, you know, part of that innocence again and part of that, or will she never be the same? And that's the big question. So I think her looking up to Joel in a way is kind of a danger to her, because Joel is definitely less so that innocence and that part that makes Ellie such a beautiful character. And so wanting to be like him kind of encourages her to fill herself back up with rage and hatred and violence and vengeance. My train of thought here leads into part 2, but I don't want to spoil anything. I will say that I think going into part 2, Ellie is continuing to lose her innocence.
Yeah.
Do you think that is what you're seeing, and do you think that is inherently a bad thing, or do you think that, because I see the first frontier of Joel's personality is survival, do you think that's something that's going to keep her alive? In a way, it's a good thing?
Probably. I mean, it's an apocalypse, right? Like, you have to experience things and go through things that we don't have to, and hopefully never will, you know? So like, it's hard to think of like, okay, what would I do? You know, like, it's hard to put yourself in that situation. But I want to kind of talk about like some of the behind the scenes of this episode a little bit. Did you know that they filmed the reunion with Ellie and Joel before she filmed the scene with David as she's chomping his face off?
It's always got to be hard for actors to get into that mindset when they.
So they filmed it out of emotional order.
Yeah.
You know, so like.
Just adds to how good of a performance Bella's giving.
Right.
She can muster that up.
Right. So like she hadn't yet performed the task that she's supposed to be so emotional about in this reunion with Joel, you know, and like she hasn't physically gone through what Ellie went through yet. And she was able to perform both moments really well, right? Like it was very believable, the shock that she was in, you know, when she found Joel again. I just thought that was interesting. And Pedro Pascal didn't even know that they filmed him out of order.
Oh, because he doesn't, she's not in that scene, yeah.
Right. Which I think that kind of goes to where, like, have you ever thought of, like, how are actors and actresses, how are they in movies that aren't good? You know, like, how do you let yourself be in a movie that's so bad? And
they're not in every scene.
Yeah, like
they don't.
There's a lot that happens in a movie that even the people making it aren't involved in.
It's not like they film the scene and then sit in the editing room and then sit with the special effects team.
But like, especially for like MCU movies or something like that, like they'll only get scenes at a time that they're in because they don't want them to spoil the rest or anything like that. Like
the stunt coordinators are literally doing some of the scene. They can't be on set for a big fight scene.
But like, doesn't that have to be? That has to be hard to put yourself in those scenes. You know, like if one, you're an actor or an actress that's kind of in a scene later in the movie or show, and you don't know what happened in the beginning. You know, like you're in Act 3, but you don't know what happened in Act 1. Isn't that a weird concept?
The only concept you have of it is what you've read on the page. So,
right.
Yeah, it definitely is a weird concept to not have that picture in your mind. But while we're touching on kind of Easter eggs and details in the game, or in the episode, I wanted to mention some of the additional quick cult leader aspects that you can notice for David, which one of them is, it's big in that scene where he comes in and he hits the young girl whose father has died, and he tells her, you may think that you don't have a father, but you will always have a father, and you will not interrupt him when he is speaking. And he's putting himself in the role not only of leader, but of her father and of her ultimate authority figure. Yeah, like the ultimate control over her. And the way the mom stands up to defend her daughter, and the subtle gesture, says nothing, points his hand out and lowers it back down. And she, much like an actual puppet, sits back down to the beat of his hand going down. And that just shows that ultimate control that cult leaders actually even have in real life. The thing that's always amazed me the most with cult leaders is what they can get their followers to allow their children to go through. Because it's unbelievable that somebody would sit on the sidelines while somebody abused their child. But it has happened many a times in these actual real world scenarios. So I think that is the highest display of power and control over another person, is to completely control them and not allow them to stop you from hurting their child when they're right there. And then he literally sits down at their table with them and eats dinner with them after doing that. And while everyone else has these scraps of dinner, he has the best meal in the house, which another huge display of power. That scene is honestly like textbook, brilliant way to write this cult, because not only does he have the best plate in the house and enacts the violence upon her daughter, and her or no one else in the room does anything, but they all start eating aggressively, super fast, like they were starving. And the food was clearly ready, but they don't serve it until David sits down to eat. And nobody eats until he eats. Like starving people that they've clearly identified are fighting for crumbs of food are waiting on him to eat. It's absolute power and control. And it's what he envies in Ellie, what he doesn't have over her.
Interesting. I want to go to another behind the scenes aspect of this episode, unless if you have more.
Hit me.
Okay. If they filmed in Waterton Park in Alberta, Canada, and they went to this place because it's supposed to be extremely snowy there. And for this scene, especially from the game, like that's how it is. Crazy winds, like
you can't see a thing in that point.
In the game, like there's a bunch of fog and stuff as it's snowing and windy, and like you can hide in the fog and stuff as you're going throughout and fighting these people. So they went to this place and there was like barely any snow, which go figure, right? So they had to bring snow from other places in this location to the town to cover like 10 blocks of this city to make it look as snowy as possible. They ended up moving 350 dump trucks of snow to make this scene look how it did in the video game. They had giant, huge fans as big as this room blowing snow, and kind of like at a ski resort or something, you know. And then the next day, when they brought all that snow, that night, it snowed.
But this is why we're always encouraging our audience to think about all the people behind the camera, because think about how many people it took to drive those 350 trips of the truck. I mean,
yeah, and like it's not all CGI. Like they did this, you know, they made this happen. They made it look as realistic as possible because it was real.
Yeah, the practical effects in this are amazing, and all this stuff couldn't have been done without makeup and hair designers, prosthetics designers, all the people behind the camera that don't tend to get as much attention. And I think that it's really important for us to kind of like take a beat and appreciate the aspects, like, because we'll say, man, that costume looked cool, or that outfit looked cool, and brush by it really
Someone had to make that. Every single little detail was thought of.
All those elements are, you know, close to the importance of the writing of the plot.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work if it looked all like it was put together on $12 in a dream.
Right. Like all of our projects.
Yeah. Two people making them, obviously very different than a staff of hundreds.
Yeah. All right, let's move into episode 9. Yeah? Okay, so episode 9 is the season finale. It's called Look for the Light. It's at a 9.2 on IMDb, which is...
tied for third highest rating.
Yeah. Yep.
The highest rated is episode 5, which I think has the most zombies, probably part of why. That's the Henry and Sam episode.
Yep.
Second highest is the one we just talked about, episode 8 at a 9.4, and then 1 and 9, the bookends of the show, are actually tied at a 9.2. Two of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, so this, we get to see the kind of origin of Ellie, how she was born, how she came into this world, and how she's immune
By
in
the
the
way,
first place.
Not in the game at all.
Nope.
So if any of you guys, like, this was just as shocking to all of us who have played the game as those who haven't, which I thought was really interesting way to kick off the show. And I did not immediately recognize that was Ashley Johnson, because
it took me a second too. It kind of looked like Jennifer Lawrence for a second there, and I was like, "There's no way."
She's running through the trees. She's pregnant. Her hair is different.
Yeah.
But, so Ashley Johnson plays Ellie's mom.
And she plays Ellie in the games.
Yeah, she voices Ellie in the game. So now she's playing Anna Williams. And
she doesn't just voice Ellie. Like they shot the movie.
Yeah, she's captured. She's
performing as Ellie.
She just lived Ellie.
Yeah,
and that's how she describes it too. Is she says, "I've lived these moments."
Right.
So it's a different way to look back on the show than some. You know, we could be considered definitely more casual viewers than Ashley Johnson, but she, as a beautiful thing for her to be included in this story. She said she wrote the actual note from the game that Ellie has from her mom. She wrote it down herself and put it in her pocket. And she had the knife in her pocket to kind of keep in the mindset of being Ellie's mom. And the parallels between her and Joel, again, are interesting because she, at this point, even with Ellie still in her stomach, is Ellie's protector, her sole protector in the world. And she's fighting tooth and nail.
At this point, she's like 27 months pregnant, running through the woods.
Super pregnant.
She's
the baby literally falls out of her.
Yeah, but she's running through the woods. She gets into this house, puts a door or a chair under the door to try to lock the door from the infected getting in, but it ends up breaking in anyways. And then you have this very it's hard to watch scene where the infected is on top of Ashley Johnson as she's pregnant, I'm imagining she's in a bunch of pain, right? Because she's in the middle of labor right now as she's trying to fight off this zombie.
You're also just in constant pain being a pregnant woman in different ways, like low back pain. All kinds
Exactly. And she ends up getting her switchblade, which is Ellie's switchblade later in the show and in the games, and kills the infected, and then realized she gave birth.
What an impactful story element, right? To have that knife not only be the thing that saved her mom's life, killing the infected that would have done them both in, but also that knife severs the bond physically and metaphorically between her and her mom, cutting the umbilical cord and saving Ellie's life in more ways than one. It saves her from being infected in that moment, saves her from being infected for the rest of her life.
Do you think, though, so once everything kind of calms down a little bit, the mom realizes that she got bit on the leg, so now she's infected. But do you think cutting the umbilical cord with that knife would have infected Ellie too? You know, because she just used that knife to
stab the...
I mean, she was kind of infected anyways, right? Because she got bit while the umbilical cord was still attached. So, like, it could still, like, travel in. And that's probably why she's immune, right?
It might not be the most scientific thing, but I really like the concept they came up with.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, either way, Ellie got infected to some capacity to where she developed this resistance. Right. But yeah, crazy scene.
It is a crazy scene. And I think that a parallel that I'm going to touch on kind of earlier than I expected is between Ellie and Jesus Christ. So this is a very common figure in movies and TV shows, the Christ-like figure. And I think in this show that it's Ellie, because she's, this house is her manger. It's kind of an immaculate conception because we never meet her dad, so we never see the conception. She is young, pure, innocent, good. And I think the biggest thing that's going to parallel her, give her the Christ figure role, is that she is the savior of humanity. Or she would be if Joel didn't rob that from her by the end of the episode. So I think that they kind of subverted that comparison in a way by the end of the episode by having Joel take that role away from her, which is something that I really, really like about this story, is that it leaves you sitting and thinking about it for days on end by the end of the story. But in this instance, where we're still talking about Ellie's mom in the beginning, I found it really harrowing to find them walking in on her with the knife pressed to her throat, to her own throat, because she's thinking, I'm going to protect my daughter until the last moment I possibly can, and if I feel myself start to turn, I will kill myself, and then I will hopefully have bought her enough time for Marlene to get back and to take care of her. And then when Marlene does get back, what does she do to again protect her daughter? She lies stone cold to her face, to probably her best friend, somebody she said, how long have we known each other? Forever. I cut the cord before I got bit. Before. And she repeats it sternly a second time without anything in between to say, don't question me. I cut it before. Don't touch my daughter. And I think that a lot of people have the misconception that maybe the show is about violence, or you hear constantly, everybody dies, everybody dies. Why does the show have to exist where everybody dies? But the show is really about this love. It's about the bond mainly it's about the bond, first of all, the parent who, how
far will you go to protect your child?
To protect your child, to protect the one you love. And the bond with a parent is, what's the word I'm looking for? Where nothing can...
Inseparable?
No, it's sort of nothing can destroy it, or it's. I'll think of it after we get cut.
Yeah.
But there's that bond that can never be broken between them, and so she would do anything for her, even cut her own throat with a knife, or risk an infected baby turning her best friend in the world, Marlene. And that's a theme parallel throughout the show. Henry and Sam, Bill and Frank, Joel and Ellie, Anna and Ellie. So that's what the show I think is really about at its heart. Don't you think? Is like The Last of Us. This may not be everyone, but this is what we have. This is The Last of Us. This is Joel and Ellie for now. This is Bill and Frank for now. And we take what we can get in this world,
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's beautiful in a way. It's not necessarily, it's dark and sad, but it also has its uplifting charm if you look at it in the right light.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this last episode with you because we haven't talked about this episode at all.
Not really.
Before we've recorded. Not at all, really.
I've already kind of let slip to you in this recording that it was one of my favorite episodes of the show.
I want to dive in more in that, but I have a question. Why was Ellie not with Marlene the whole time?
So there's a line in the show where I keep messing up her name, Anna, right? Ellie's mom. Anna. Yes, I had it right. Why did I get second guess myself? So there's a line in the show where Anna says, make sure that you get her to someone where she'll be safe, where someone will take care of her. Essentially, she's saying, keep her safe. Not necessarily you keep her safe, but make sure that someone does. And I think the reason that she says that is because she said they've known each other their whole life. She knows who Marlene is. Marlene probably isn't motherly. Marlene is the leader of the Fireflies. Not only does she have too many other responsibilities, but even if she casts those responsibilities aside, she is not a motherly person. And Ellie being right next to the leader of the Fireflies is probably in more danger than most other places. Well, they're seen as a terrorist group, but they're definitely a military organization. Marlene at the end of the show and the game says, we lost like a bunch of guys getting here to St. Mary's. Like if Ellie was with her, she doesn't necessarily believe that it's the safest place for her. So Marlene does this brilliant thing where she prioritizes Ellie's safety over her own morals, and she leaves her with her enemy. Because inside a Fedra base, being raised by them, she's not going to get killed by zombies, I'll tell you that much.
So why didn't she want Ellie to come with Riley and her?
Because she's sending Riley somewhere dangerous. She's sending Riley to fight Fedra, to fight and kill Fedra.
But then what, like a year or two later, she wants to bring her across the country?
Well, that's the thing is that she's
like what evolved technologically or scientifically to where they're like, oh, like she could save the world.
Here's the way that I see it in my mind, and I see it kind of like a scale when I envision it, because I thought the same thing that you've thought. I've kind of run through the same thought process. It's a great question, but she is prioritizing her friend's final wish to her in the world at the beginning of the episode. Somebody she loved. She's prioritizing what Anna wants and keeping Ellie safe. Now when she learns, and that has a huge weight to her, right? That's how I see it on the scale. And then when she learns that Ellie is the potential for the cure, now there's some weight on the other side of the scale. There's her debt she has to humankind, her main goal in life, even above her friend, even above herself, is to try and save the world from Fedra, from this illness that's created the apocalypse. Now, when she gets back to the hospital, she learns from the doctor that Ellie's going to have to die to make this cure. And that's where the scale totally shifts, because she doesn't want to kill Ellie. We see that in her eyes. We see that she says about Joel, he's the only other person in this hospital that understands the true weight of this decision. I'm not going to kill him for that reason. She says it in the game, I know for sure. But she feels that weight too. But the reason she makes a different choice than Joel, not only, Joel's obviously going to make that decision because they picked the worst person in the world to take Ellie to the hospital. Because Joel, the relationship he had with his daughter that he lost and the skills he has to never let that happen again, they picked the worst person for that. But Marlene's going to make the opposite decision because even in just that one trip to St. Mary's, she said they lost so many guys. Imagine over the decades the amount of people, close friends, that she has watched die for this cause, for saving humanity. That shifts the scale away from her debt to her friend, from her debt to Ellie, to those debts had to be worth something. And Marlene knows that Ellie feels the same way. We, as the audience, know Ellie feels the same way because Ellie says to Joel, she tells them the story of Riley. And she said, when Joel says that they can turn back, we don't have to do this. She tells them the story of Riley, and she says that her name was Riley. She was the first to die. Then it was Tess. Then it was Sam. And Ellie has survivor's guilt. She feels the weight of all of these people that have died for her to get where she is, the sacrifices that have been made for her to potentially save the world. So Ellie would sacrifice herself, and Marlene would sacrifice Ellie, not only because Marlene is the person that recognizes, like Joel also, I'm sure recognizes, but ignores, that Ellie would make that decision to sacrifice herself, but Marlene would also make that decision because everything, all the horrible things Marlene has done in her life and the people that she's lost have to have been for something, for this. And if she would trade all that she's done in the past for Ellie's one life, then she would go with Joel and save Ellie and leave her, but she wouldn't make that decision.
So I have another question for you that I've seen floating around.
I have another 10-minute answer.
Who was in the right and who was in the wrong? Marlene or Joel?
I have an interesting dual-sided coin answer for this. So
I don't think it is as black and white.
I think Neil
Druckmann
put it best, which was actually, he quoted his father. He asked his father who he thought made the right decision. So his father had this scenario in real life he equated it to. There was this man who was a prisoner of war in Jerusalem, Neil Druckmann's home country, and they traded a bunch of their prisoners over to get that man back. And he said, do you think they made the right decision? His dad said, I can give you two answers. As the prime minister of Israel, I can tell you they made the wrong decision because it made us look weak. As that boy's father, I would have traded the entire country in order to get my son back. And I think that's the perspective we all have. They did test screenings of the game. And at the end, one of the main questions they asked people when they finished the game was, what did you think of Joel's decision? And it was pretty much split 50-50 between he made the right decision and he made the wrong decision. But when you look at the demographic of people who were parents, 100% without fail, parents agreed with Joel's decision. And I think that as a player in me who played as Joel, I think he made the right decision because I would have not sacrificed Ellie. And if it was my daughter or my niece, who I'm very close with, I would like to think that I would have the strength of character and the physical skills and attributes that Joel has to do exactly what he did. Because I would hope I could do the same thing to save her life. But as a utilitarian, as somebody standing outside the situation, and even in Marlene's position, I can agree with Marlene because the biggest point of all that I brought up is that line that she says to Joel. Joel says, that's not your decision to make. And Marlene says, and it's not yours either. It should be hers. And what do you think she would decide? Because both of them know.
But she didn't even give her a chance to decide.
But she knows what she would decide. And putting that on a 14-year-old, it's almost kinder to not put that decision on a 14-year-old's head and just do what you know that they would want to do.
But you can't just assume that that's like what they would want, even if that is ultimately what they want. They have to go through that themselves.
I think from the conversation,
like I can't just decide something for you because I know you really well and I know that you would lay down your life for this cause or whatever. Like I can't just kill you for that cause without you like actually deciding to do that yourself.
I think that you raise a really good point, and I think that the best thing about the show and the game is that we can debate this. You can debate this back and forth on,
right?
But I think that Ellie kind of unveils to us what her decision was. To the audience, she unveils what her decision would be when she talks about Riley and Tess and Sam and all the people that were lost for her to get here. I think that she says a line something like, "This has to be for something." And if the choice was between, we ultimately find out the choice that she would have made, honestly. But and at the end of the episode, when she asks Joel, just tell me the truth, cut the shit, what happened back there? And Joel just decides to lie to her and says, I was telling you the truth. There's kind of, you can take what you want from it, but what I read from her face is, all right, I'm accepting this lie. Believing the alternative is too horrible. And I think Ellie is too smart and too acutely aware of the situation to not know that he's still lying to her. But she kind of can read in her heart of hearts that she's heartbroken at the idea that basically that it was all for nothing. And Joel tells her, it's not your fault. And she says, I know that, it's not my fault. But all the same, sometimes when things are out of your control and they're not your fault, it still doesn't change how you feel. And that's the spot she's in, where she's still heartbroken that all those people that she cared about died. And beyond that, the rest of the world, people will continue to die. You find notes all over the game of harrowing stories. One of the worst ones I found in Last of Us Part 2 is a kid who writes a letter to Santa saying that he wishes Santa would help his dad because his dad is so sad after losing their mom, and he's like, especially on the tough days when dad locks himself in his room and has his hard days, and he won't talk to me. And it's like, God, that's so depressing. And the first thing I thought when I read that in the game is Joel kind of did that to this kid. You know, depending on when the note was written, Joel took lives away from people and put people through all these depressing hardships by taking away the cure and making that selfish decision. Now, would I make the same selfish decision? I probably would. But that's what's so hard about this whole thing. I think that the biggest factor, though, that makes Joel kind of in the wrong is that Ellie, I think, would have gone with Marlene.
But again, you can't just say that. Like,
so, but what's the difference between the two? Is waiting for her to wake up and asking her, and then the same thing happens, where she goes with Marlene. So I think that's
yeah, because like, don't you think everyone has like free will, and that like someone else can't just dictate your fate because it's for the greater good? Like,
that is what
isn't that something that you have to decide for yourself? And since Marlene didn't give her the opportunity to, in that sense, Marlene is in the wrong.
But the same argument could be made for Joel, that he's robbing her of the choice too, definitely.
By killing everyone?
Yeah, and taking her away. He killed the doctor. That he eliminated the possibility for her to make the choice by killing that doctor. So they both, committed the crime that you're talking about.
Yeah, either way. But you've been arguing for Joel, so I'm just playing the opposite.
Which we do debate episodes, so we should actually do a debate episode on Joel versus Marlene. I think that would be a blast.
Like, same with you, as someone who has played as Joel for the entirety of the game, who's been with Ellie the entirety of the game. Like, that's the decision that I would want to have happened. Like I wouldn't have want Ellie to just go under and then she died. She didn't get to choose. Marlene's in the wrong for that, but she ended up saving or not saving anyway. Like, I would not have been happy or satisfied with that ending, I don't think. But at the same time, I felt kind of like Ellie at the end of the game, where it was like, well, that's it. Like, all of that was for nothing. I just traveled across the country in this game, went through all of this stuff with Joel, with Tess, with everyone else, Sam, Henry, everyone that they've encountered. And it was literally all for nothing. I think I even said that to you once I finished the game. I was like, what was the point of this whole game? Like, nothing got solved, I
still, magnificently though, despite everything you just said being so true, I still am in love with the ending. Because not only...
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that I felt the same way that Ellie felt, which is a cool connection.
Exactly. But I think that is what is so special about it, because I felt the way that Joel felt, and you felt the way that Ellie felt, which I think that when you've been... I'm very close with my nieces and nephews, and I feel kind of that allegiance to them that Joel feels to Ellie, like that I don't want to say found family, but that similar kind of feeling. And I like to think that when you're in that position, what you want to do more than anything is protect them. Protect them from the world, protect them from themselves, protect them from yourself, like imparting your bad qualities on them. Like, and Joel really is trying to do that. And I feel like for my family members, I would sell my soul down the river. I'd sell my soul to the devil to protect them in this way that Joel does. And I would want to do the same things he does. Because not only does he goes into that Terminator mode that I described and completely shuts himself off from every bit of humanity. And they describe it in the Last of Us Companion podcast as him burning his soul, which he is... The biggest part of him burning his soul isn't killing all these Firefly members. It's something he's done 100 times before. It's sacrificing the future of humanity for the one girl. And so he's definitely putting aside what he feels is morally right to do what matters to him the most selfishly. And he's completely just killed all those people, takes Ellie and leaves. Beyond that, he's not just protecting Ellie in that sense. When she asks him what happened, he lies to her to protect her from the truth. He lies to her to protect her from the guilt. He lies to her to protect her from dealing with that memory for the rest of her life, that she lives at the cost of everyone else in the world having a pleasant world to live in. She lives at the cost of the apocalypse. So he tries to alleviate her of that guilt, like it's the most fatherly protective thing that he could have done. So that's why I love it. The last line in the game in the show is him lying to her. I know it's terrible, but I love it.
Yeah, me too. And the last thing that I want to talk about, maybe you have another few things that you want to touch on, but the last thing I want to talk about is, what did you think of how they portrayed that final, like, action fight scene, like you said, where Joel kind of goes full Terminator mode? Like, how was it in the game? How was it in the show? And did the show live up to the game in your eyes?
I think that the show lived up to the game for the reason that it was the best action sequence in the entire show. Based on comparative value, I felt that action sequence a lot. and the somber approach that he took to it, the soft tones of the music, which is actually the exact same music that they play in the game, only they played in the game when he's holding Ellie in his arms walking out of the hospital as everyone's chasing behind him. They play it through that whole long fight sequence, and it is brutal. Like, it furthest thing from glorifying violence. It's emotional, it's sad, you're distraught. Like, the look on Joel's face is, like I said, it's not a look of rage. It's a cold look of him completely dissociating himself from being a human, from these other people being humans. All they are at that point is just something in between him and Ellie. And everyone that is on the ground gurgling in blood, he says to himself, if there's some small chance that you can get back up and stop me from getting to my goal, I'm going to put a knife in your skull. And he does it. And he kills a ton of people. I thought it was badass, but at the same time, deeply moving and sad and affecting. It changed the way that I think about Joel as a character moving forward, changed the way I'm thinking about not only what he's capable of physically, but emotionally. And it definitely feels different than the game, because in the game, I don't want to attribute to the argument of games, you know, leading to violence, but in the games, they all just feel like NPCs. They just feel like nobodies. You shoot them and they die. In the show, they feel like, oh, these are people. Like, these are people working a shift. The security detail, these are people, they probably have family members, husbands, especially playing the second game, you know they have family members, children, husbands, wives, and Joel's putting them down like cattle. And so, like, I felt more emotional at the point of the fighting in the show, I would say. So I feel like they really hit that nail on the head. It's part of the reason, and the show is so good, I can't even definitively say it's my favorite episode. But, like, not episode 9, episode 8, episode 1. I don't know. One of them is my favorite episode. But what did you think about how it compared to the game?
For this last scene, I thought it was pretty good. Like you said, it had the emotional weight, and it still had the same outcome at the end where he did end up killing the doctor, to where there was no chance that they could try to do this again. He still ended up killing Marlene at the end as well, to where there's no chance that she could get back to Ellie.
I love the scene with Marlene.
So I'm glad that they kept all of that the same.
They kept so accurate.
Yeah.
Everything from the doctor scene on, 1-to-1 accuracy.
Yeah, I think he killed the nurses in the game too.
Well, I think it's your choice. Right?
Is it?
I don't think you have to shoot them. It's not a cutscene. Because when you walk, so in the game, there's two different things. When you walk in, you like have your gun out, and the surgeons, like, they're all standing there over Ellie. And what I did was, the doctor like stepped back, I immediately shot him. I was like, let me set the tone for this room. But if you're unlike me, and you're not in like a raged out mode trying to save Ellie, if you wait for a second, he'll look at you, recognize you, grab the scalpel like he does in the show and point at you and say, I'm not going to let you take her.
So you shot him before that point?
I shot him immediately. Yeah, I was like, back up, dude. You know, like, he was going to kill her.
Oh, that stopped. Why'd that stop? All right.
But this is such a phenomenal show. As we come to a close on the episode, I do want to ask you what your favorite episode was. I touched on mine being episodes 8, 9, and 1. Gun to my head, I would probably have to pick episode 9.
8, 9, 1. The last one. I think my favorite one is Endure and Survive, episode 5.
This seems to be you're in agreement with the masses, because that's the highest rated episode of the show.
Yeah. I like that one a lot. We get to see, I think, the show at its full potential. Well, we get to see the emotional arcs and twists and turns that we have throughout the whole episode, but then we also get to see the action. And I'm not saying like the whole show has to be action the whole time, but that's the part of the things that I enjoy. I like watching the choreography. I like looking at the set design, costume design, how they mix in the CGI and the emotional impact of it. I like watching that stuff, and that stuff I value. And this one definitely had the most action. I do like episode 2. I feel like that one was pretty chilling as you're like sneaking around the clickers and stuff too. I like that one a lot.
I found episode 2 to be one of my least memorable. But episode 9, I will say, the reason that is my favorite, that I would have to pick it, is because I feel like they went exactly perfectly copying the parts in the games that mattered the most, and then the areas that they improved on, I feel like were the best improvements made throughout the series, other than the addition of Sam being deaf and Bill and Frank background. Those were great, but adding in the backstory of Joel, where he attempted to unalive himself, I thought was incredibly emotional. And the best line in that episode, potentially the whole series to me, is when she says, "You're trying to tell me that time heals all wounds," like a vague platitude. And he says, "It wasn't time that did it." And both
my
of them,
heart.
I was about to cry.
My heart.
Both of them know that Ellie saved him. And for all the times they've saved each other's life physically, she saved him emotionally because he had no reason to really keep on living. He says that when he tried to pull the trigger, he flinched. And to me, what that is that is Joel's survival instinct. Because I've talked about before, Joel's number one instinct is survival. That's ingrained deep into him, into his muscles and bones. So when he tried to shoot himself, he flinched because his body wants to survive even if his spirit is ready to give up. Mm-hmm. So he says later in the episode, you keep going on and you find something to fight for. I think that's one of the most important lessons and themes to take from the show for real life, is we keep going and find something to fight for. We're going to find something. You have to keep going. And he found Ellie. That's what he's trying to tell her, is he was just kind of going through the motions, even with Tess. Like, he didn't feel like he had a reason to live until Ellie, and she gave him that light. So we definitely see that. Well, we talked about her being empty in episode 8. We see that light come back into her, that innocence, with the scene with the giraffe. And like, we see that childlike joy and innocence refill her. So I think that is what keeps Joel going on. I love that addition of that heart-to-heart scene where they sit down and talk. It's a little bit different from in the game. In the game, I think more so Joel opens up to her about his daughter, about Sarah, which he does a little bit later in the very end of the show. But I like that change, and I liked all the other little changes that they added into episode 9 to make it my favorite.
Very nice. I've heard that they're in talks for making a part 2.
Oh, they're also in talks for making a video game, part 3.
Ooh.
From what I've heard, rumors.
Nice. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is definitely the most popular thing on TV right now, and I'm sure the game purchases and participation in playing has like skyrocketed from the show. But I've heard that they are talking about doing a part 2, but they said that it's too long of a story to leave in one season.
Who said?
One of the creators.
So what I heard them talk about on the companion podcast was that it seemed like the way that Mason and Druckmann were talking were that they were definitely going to do season 2, definitely going to be based on The Last of Us Part 2, the show. One thing that they said is that they're going to pay homage the same way that they did in season 1, that they're going to keep the soul of the material intact. So for those of you that played the game, that tells us that major plot points will still definitely be in part 2, and that they're going to take advantage of the way TV shows allow them to shift perspectives even more so than a game does. So we'll definitely see the perspective switches. We'll definitely see more fleshed out backgrounds. I didn't hear them say that, but that would be cool if it was true, because that just means more content, more seasons of the show.
Right. All right. I think that kind of wraps up this episode. We've gone for over an hour. Wow. This is again our 4th episode on this show, and I'm sure we'll do more in the future as well. Do you think any other show this year is gonna beat this show?
Chance.
You don't think so? What about Invincible?
There's no chance. I rate them differently because it's animated, but even still, I think Invincible would have a tough hill to climb.
Dang, I think that's really saying something, because I think that has been our most anticipated show of the year.
Yeah, I mean,
that's crazy.
It's tough to rate an animated show against it, but every episode of The Last of Us was a hit, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I have I have a problem with recency bias. So
yes, that's true.
I have a strong recency
in a few months, there'll be another favorite show of all time that Andrew will be talking about.
Well, it's not that often. Calm down. Invincible was probably the last show I felt like this about. So season 2 of Invincible might be better. We'll have to, but I don't think anything else would touch it.
All right, we'll stay tuned. Anything else you want to say about The Last of Us?
I want to say thank you guys so much, those of you that sat through with us. Listening, especially to this long episode, but to all this content that we've been, Aaron said, covering tons of episodes for The Last of Us. If you haven't gone back and watched those episodes, go back and check them out. We have lots of insights and behind-the-scenes information for the show and our interpretations.
Yeah, you can check out our full episodes on YouTube, Spotify. We have clips of our episodes on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube Shorts as well. So go check those out. Post every Monday and Thursday. And that's a wrap.